Hey, Hunter. Well, today we are talking about something really interesting, something that has definitely proliferated in the world of e-commerce and has kind of trickled through into our world as far as financial analysis goes, and that is buy now, pay later. And so just to give our audience a little bit of background, you kind of want to run through first of all how it works. We'll probably kind of refer to this as BNPL just to make it a little bit easier on ourselves here, but yeah, I mean, kind of like how did this get started? What does that actually mean when someone says buy now, pay later?
Yeah, so there are a lot of companies doing it nowadays. Probably the most popular one is Affirm, or at least that you'll see around. And so I think like a lot of people, I've seen these things around, I've heard of them, but unless you've really used them or done a lot of research into them, it's easy to just like kind of not have a great idea of how they work a little bit more formally. And so essentially what these were initially founded on, at least, was the pay in four. So that's every 2 weeks. Across the course of 2 months, it allows you to pay for something that you buy now, with no interest charge, no additional fees involved in that. And essentially how that works is that the buy now pay later company, call it a firm, they'll process the transaction in the place of a Visa, a MasterCard, who's already taking a 2, 3, 4% fee. A firm will charge a little bit more oftentimes, but drive more sales through people who maybe not able to pay for it today, but want it now and can pay for it over the course of a couple months. So generally that's how that works. Nowadays, they've moved into 6-month, 12-month financing, which is where you get an interest rate applied to it. And it acts a lot more like credit card debt, except for the fact that there's no credit check required for any of this, which is a big key point that we'll talk more about later. But that creates all sorts of issues on the financial side and on the back end, but also really ease of access for people. So that can be a really good thing, can be a really concerning thing in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I think the lack of that credit check is really interesting. Of course, it gives people access to kind of a credit card alternative in a form of splitting payments that they wouldn't necessarily have otherwise, especially if they have bad credit or low credit. But as we're going to talk about, there's some issues whenever you start talking about the lack of credit history when it comes to these things. But I think it's really interesting to see how the buy now, pay later has proliferated. I mean, it seems like just a few years ago is when I saw every single time I checked out online was Affirm or Afterpay or Klarna, one of these groups that was offering a split payment. I had not really seen that so much before. And doing my research, I really realized that a lot of this proliferated during the COVID period because people were stuck at home. All they could do was buy goods, TVs, computers, electronics, things that you're going to use in home, new furniture. So relatively high ticket items, but things that you have to do at home versus services. You couldn't travel, you can do things out. So it led to a lot of e-commerce, and that created a big window of opportunity for these Afterpay groups. They said, hey, you're making a lot of purchases at home online. We can split those payments for you, reduce the burden. You can spend more, even though you're not really saving anything at the end of the day. You're just splitting those payments, but you're able to spend more right now and pay for it over a period of time. And I saw that Affirm has actually been in existence since 2012, and Afterpay just came a couple of years after that, which I found pretty fascinating considering it seems like a recent phenomenon. But they've really exploded in the recent period. You have from January to April of this year, there's over 25 billion of e-commerce purchases made using an Afterpay program, or a buy now, pay later program, if you will. And so I just find it really fascinating to see the growth. I mean, it really exploded during COVID, but it's continued to grow year after year. And this trend is something that's both very fascinating from a financial kind of analysis standpoint and a little bit concerning when you're talking about the health of a consumer and the debt that they are undertaking.
Yeah, and with all of that money that you're talking about that's being put into these products or, transacted by these products, there are a lot of risks that come along with that, particularly to the consumer. Obviously, overspending is a big risk because you're making a bunch of purchases now that you're planning to pay for over time. So you're pulling those forward, but it's really hard once you pull spending forward to just stop spending. A couple months goes by or a month and you want that new thing, you want some new clothes, a new event is going on. Well, you thought the concert last month was, the one that you really wanted to go to, but here's one even better. And so now you're pulling that spending forward too. And so it really creates, it's easy to create a really unsustainable bubble here. I don't want to paint these as just bad products necessarily. There is a time and a place, and on the surface level, it isn't an issue to spread it over time. And sometimes that can help you get over a short-term hurdle. Maybe you're starting a new job and that first paycheck is just a couple weeks away, but it's still a couple weeks away. So it can help you bridge events like that, but it does pose those overspending risks to, for people who are in a stable situation and just want to pull that spending forward. It can create, unsustainable debt loads if you're, anything unforeseen happens. All of a sudden you have an emergency event, medical, you lose your job, something happens to, your car that you have to pay for. All sorts of things can happen that all of a sudden you have, payments coming due that are higher than your normal expenses for things you've already bought and can't necessarily return. And, that really just exposes you a lot more. And so that's kind of like what we've seen within the credit card space and the traditional finance space of why credit gets reported in the first place. It can be tracked. Banks can, have a better idea of how levered you actually are before extending that credit. And then that gets people into with Affirm, Afterpay, all of these buy now, pay laters, is that if you miss payments, that starts to get really expensive. Like to the tune, we're talking credit card numbers again, of you're paying 15, 20% in late fees on the interest, but then you also get hit with fees and just all sorts of stuff, which can turn a convenience item or even, a short-term necessity item into a much larger financial issue for you.
Right. And I think you're exactly right. I mean, staggering these payments out, delaying that initial purchase price is what can get people into trouble. And I think that's why I saw that 1 in 4 Americans actually have regretted doing a buy now, pay later. One, because you have to be very disciplined about making the payments whenever they're due. To your point, interest rates are very high if you miss a payment. There are also fees if you potentially miss a payment, depending on who you're using. And these are coming straight from your bank account. So you either have to set up some kind of direct deposit from your bank account to the buy now, pay later program, or you have to manually transfer these at the due date every 2 weeks or whatever kind of cadence you're on for the payment. But it creates these operational levers that create some opportunity for the consumer to miss a payment or have an issue, avoiding those fees or interest. I thought it was really interesting when I saw that this isn't just a issue for low income consumers. I saw that roughly 40% of households making $100,000 or more have actually missed or been delinquent on a buy now, pay later payment. And a lot of that's just because of the structure of what I just ran through, is that you have to make sure that you're making these payments on that specific date so that you don't go past the deadline. And if you forget to do that, all of a sudden your purchase that was a couple $100 up front that was going to be spread out, even if that was interest or fee free, now is going to cost you maybe $220 because of the fees and interest that you incurred. So as long as you are paying attention to making those payments on time, being very smart and scheduling periods for you to make those payments, and you stay on top of it, it can be a useful financial tool, but you want to make sure that you're doing these at the right time and not incurring that interest or those late fees.
And that's a big point, is that this adds one more layer to your financial, like your personal finances, which is already, oftentimes a cloudy picture. And it just makes it even cloudier. So it's another layer. And these companies don't do it out of the kindness of their hearts to front you money. They do earn a little bit on the transaction fees, like we mentioned, but the bulk of their money comes, kind of like credit cards, unfortunately, comes from the people who miss payments and incur those heavy expenses. And, like you mentioned, even people making over $100,000 are having trouble with it. Over 40% of people with, any of these buy now, pay later balances or have used them find themselves behind on payments. Just 40%, you're talking almost half of people using these items start incurring penalties for it. All of a sudden, it doesn't sound like free money anymore. And that's where the big concern is that, I don't want to use the word predatory, but it kind of can be in a lot of senses. It's banking on people getting behind and missing those payments. And that's kind of, taking advantage of people a little bit, that I don't like personally. But, again, there is a time and a place. And, I think it's a really interesting product for a lot of people.
Yeah. And I don't necessarily think that these companies have the intention of taking advantage of individuals, even though they know it's going to happen. Just like a credit card company knows that people are going to roll over their payments or be late on their payments and receive that really astronomical interest rate. But they do charge the merchants at the end of the day as well. So you're talking anywhere between 1.5% to 7% goes back to that original merchant, whether that's, a Nike, some kind of consumer goods company that is using one of these Afterpay programs, because they're happy to pay up for the extra business that they're going to get from an Affirm, from an Afterpay, one of these groups. And I think that's pretty fascinating.
Yeah. And so I think that brings us into like the broader economic concerns. We've talked about the individual, the concerns that you have with that. But then, what does that mean for the broader economy? For all of this, what people are calling phantom debt laying out there, that isn't easily traceable. It's not reported to credit rating agencies. Your bank doesn't know about it, all of this stuff. You want to take us through that a little bit?
Yeah, sure thing. So you mentioned phantom debt, and I think that's a word that very commonly has become associated with buy now, pay later. And that's because the banks, because it's not tied to credit, as you mentioned, it's debt that's essentially untraceable. It's really hard for economists, analysts, credit agencies to have an idea of how much debt outstanding an individual has in buy now, pay later. Of course, like you mentioned, these were originally intended to be essentially short-term loans, kind of payday kind of stuff. You're waiting for your next paycheck. You want to split this current payment. Okay, that makes sense. But now that you're talking about 6 months, 12 months financing, that becomes a different story. And so that's a real level of debt that can be attained over a 12-month period. And the financial system in general has no insight into this. As I mentioned before, that's a benefit to people who have bad credit or no credit, but it's an issue whenever it talks about, hey, issuing a credit card to somebody who maybe has a bunch of buy now, pay later debt, and the credit agencies, the overall credit system doesn't have insight into that, can create some issues. And it's also not necessarily good for the consumer when you can be potentially loading up a lot of BNPL debt and then taking out a credit card and creating spending on that as well.
Yeah, exactly. It might look good for people with that low credit, no credit in the short term, but in the long term, if they want to build credit, eventually you make your way up, get that mortgage someday. That creates a lot of long-term problems for people. And so that's where a big problem comes into play. And while it's certainly not the same thing, I can't help but point out that it's a little analogous to the 2008 Great Financial Crisis with the housing market, because they're issuing mortgages on ninja loans, no income, no job people. And so no credit checks were going on. And so they allowed people to rack up a whole bunch of debt that wasn't really, being reported on and wasn't being properly vetted. And so while this is certainly a very different situation, I think it's worth pointing out that there are, when you start to look at it, a lot of similarities between the two.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think it's anytime you create too easy of access to money, for whether it's an individual or a corporation for that matter, it can create significant issues. And so I think, allowing people to take on this debt and thinking, oh yeah, I'll just split the payment and it'll be easy. And then they realize, okay, well, I've got to make sure I set up my direct deposit from my bank and have to do all these things in order to not get charged those fees. That's where the complexity enters the system. But just by getting access to that debt so easily in the first place, it can create issues. I think overspending is certainly the biggest problem that consumers are encountering. And as we mentioned, it doesn't have to be a bad thing. This Afterpay can be very useful as long as you're diligent about how you're using it. But I would also recommend that if you are looking for, a payment delay method or process, credit cards, if you're especially new in your investing journey, I think this was something interesting that I found was that a huge portion of the Afterpay users are Gen Z. So your up and coming workers of the world are using Afterpay pretty significantly, or buy now, pay later pretty significantly. And that means that they're not adding to their credit. They're not generating a credit score, which, nobody wants to think about purchasing a mortgage someday, especially when you're looking at rates of 7% right now in a super hot housing market. But this is going to be something that could potentially bite these consumers in the future if they don't go ahead and start working on that credit journey. And while I'm not a credit analyst or give kind of credit financial advice, I think that'd be a smart method, at least in addition to a BNPL, if not a better alternative than this.
Yeah, because credit cards kind of have a 1 month buffer anyway, already built in of no interest. You don't want to be carrying credit card balance because that gets even more expensive than these Afterpay Affirm products. But that 1 month and then really just building that credit is great for the long-term plans. And one more thing I want to point out for people is that, you mentioned setting up your direct deposit from your bank account. Even if you do all the right things, there's still a chance that, hey, your rent came out a day early or, whatever. And so just because of timing between your rent check and your paycheck, you don't have a sufficient balance in your checking account to pay for it. Well, there's a missed payment. Your direct deposit auto pay that you set up and you did everything right doesn't go through. And if you don't immediately catch that, then that could set you up for recurring missed payments or late payments or underpayments really. But even if you catch that on the one time, that's still your missed payment fee. There's just a flat number that they can apply to that, and you missed a payment and now you're behind. So, it's just adding more complexity to the system. And so, when you use these things, just another word of warning in that even if you do everything right on the front end, it's still something that you need to continue to measure and maintain along the way.
Yeah, and so I think getting into that personal finance 101 session right here is that I think most importantly, if you can't really afford something, try not to buy it in the first place. I mean, the fact that this buy now, pay later is getting offered on a lot of goods under $100, if you feel the need to split that and it's not something that you absolutely need, I'd highly recommend against that. You mentioned earlier, if you have some kind of one-off issue of something that you have to pay for, something in your apartment or your car breaks and you have to make a sizable payment, you want to make sure you have some kind of buffer in your checking account or savings account in order to cover expenses like that. And if you have this buy now, pay later debt that's stacking up, it can create a lot of issues for you, and you don't want to feel like you're under that stress of constantly having to make these payments, even if you're not spending in maybe the current period of time. And so I think first of all is limiting your use of that as much as possible. And then two, as we've mentioned time and time again on this episode, just be smart if you're going to use it. Read the fine print, know what you're going to pay if you end up missing a payment, and maybe that'll help spur you a little bit to make sure that you get all your payments on time.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks, Victor.